Okay.
Well, click up. Oops. Is this still working? Yes. Oops. Well, I've just got to lost the sponge bit.
What was I talking about? Oh, yes.
It's in the pocket, isn't it?
And is that the clicker?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, yes, so I'll just introduce, I'll do the kind of, as we're changing session now, so Tim Musson is a former colleague from years ago, but he's set himself up very successfully as a GDPR, a data protection training person, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I presume that's still audible? Yeah. Okay, I think a bit like Laura when she sort of got the email, what are you going to talk about? I thought, I'll try and come up with something that looks a bit sexy, but and sort of pretend it's about big data and cybersecurity. So I came up with dark data, surveillance, and security, the issues. Lots of question marks in this presentation, lots and lots of question marks. And I'm someone who likes to sort of come at something like GDPR and data protection, going back to sort of first principles a lot of things, and actually argue from the principles, from the rights, and just sort of take it in a nice simple fashion. So what's dark data? Well, data is, of course, your most valuable asset. But I'm not sure that you think all of it is, because there is this stuff, dark data. I almost want to call it stuff rather than data. It's stuff that is you don't know you've got, maybe, you're not quite sure what it is, and probably you don't use it. I defy anyone here to say their organization doesn't have any of this. There'll almost certainly be data that you have that you've got no real intention of using. You might know you've got it, but there's probably stuff you even don't know you've got. So a few questions I want to ask is, what's collected? Why is it collected or not? What personal data is involved, so that now gets it sort of GDPR stuff. And what are the data protection issues? I have to admit, I prefer to talk about data protection these days rather than GDPR, because there was so much GDPR fatigue going around, and data protection goes wider than GDPR. So, what dark data do you collect? Some interesting thoughts here. Well, there's how much email is floating around in your servers? Let's just say a lot. How much of it is ever going to be looked at again or ever used? For how much of it is there an actual purpose? Probably very limited. How you address that, I have no idea. I think email is the most difficult stuff that you ever deal with. You might have lots of records of meeting minutes that no one's ever going to look at. Presentations, research, and reports, very similar. Customer and account information. Do you actually keep stuff about customers and their accounts longer than you should be, longer than you ever need to? Is it ever going to get used, ever going to get accessed? Scanned and photocopied documents. A lot of this now goes beyond just digital. It possibly goes onto paper as well. Now, I know paper doesn't really fit into this event, but has anyone in here, their organization, got a paper mountain? I was doing some training for a big asset management company last year. I was talking about data retention, and someone said, what do we do about the warehouses in Dublin that are full of paper? So I just pulled out a box of matches out of my pocket. It's about all you can do sometimes. And people say, oh yeah, but there's this new law, we can't just suddenly deal with this retention issue. Well, no, the same law was in place about that since the beginning of the century. So there's no excuse really for retention suddenly hitting you. Old document versions. If you've got your current version of documents, do you really need all sorts of previous versions, which you've almost certainly got floating around? Ex-employee information. That's an interesting one. Big housing association I was talking to, someone said, they've never got rid of anybody's data. And this person was very concerned about that, and I saw that sharp intake of breath on Laura's face just then. So, you might need to keep something about employees, but you actually need to keep all of it, most of it, much of it will be unused. You don't need, once someone's left, you need to keep disciplinary action data, for example? Probably not. What else? Unmonitored log files. That's an interesting little one. All sorts of log files get generated, probably never looked at, but you're storing them. Backups. Oh, backups. Please, do we have to talk? Yeah, I have to talk about backups. Backups, you've got all this data, and very rarely do you actually need to use it. And a lot of it you probably don't need anyway, because it includes a whole load of stuff you don't need. And the wonderful, wonderful CCTV. Whose organizations use CCTV? A few, yeah. How long did you keep the stuff for? Did you say 30? Yeah, everybody says 30. And when I say why, yeah, because that's what the system does, default. Now, if you're only ever going to use it for a few days, because that's what you're needing it for, basically the rest of that data is illegal. You don't have a legitimate purpose for it. So it should be deleted. but you're not the only, for everybody does, but you shouldn't be. Okay, so some thoughts about what dark data might be flying around. We have BOIOD data. I'm sure, again, you all got lots of that. All sorts of stuff where people bring their own devices, mobile phones, tablets, laptops, and you'll be checking on what clients are looking at, what on the network, what are they downloading, what malware are they introducing. And of course, this is actually all about people, because you know who owns those devices. There's a lot of personal data possibly flying around in there. And you may be even sort of monitoring what individuals are doing, so you're into surveillance. A lot of data, a lot of stuff. So why is it collected? Well, the law says you must have specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes if it's personal data. Doesn't worry, if it's not personal data, this does not apply, of course. So, do you know why you're are you using it for possibly, lots of question marks, security analytics? Could be a reasonable justification for processing data. Are you just collecting it because you can? CCTV. Yeah. Default settings on software can just automatically create all sorts of files that you might not need. But it just happens because you never thought about changing it. Is it just because staff like to keep emails? I want to keep every email I've ever received. Very difficult to impose discipline on email retention. And maybe you're doing it for staff surveillance, which is perfectly legitimate as long as it's done right. Okay? Of course, some data is collected and processed, but not stored any length of time. This is sort of fairly ephemeral stuff. But of course, if it is processed, you still need to think about why it's processed. Why is it not kept? Should it have been kept? Was it of use? Was it not? Because even if it just goes straight through your machine, data protection requirements still apply. So it shouldn't be processed unless you can justify it according to the principles. So what personal data is involved? So it's personal data if it relates to an identified or identifiable natural person. And of course, the standard comment is, of course, dead people are not natural anymore, so they don't have personal data. But identified or identifiable is an interesting one. It relates to some of the things Laura was talking about. Essentially, if you can put that data together with other data, or somebody else could steal it and use it together with stuff they'd already got to identify who it is, then it could be personal data. I remember a friend, he had a client who was building apps for mobile phones. And this client said, well, I only have phone numbers, so I don't know who it is. So it's not personal data. And of course, unless they're burner phones with no relation to anything, they'll be on a database somewhere. So, personal data. So your BYOD data is very likely to be personal data. Emails are almost certainly going to have a lot of personal data in it. Customer and account information is going to have a lot of personal data in it. Backups are going to include personal data, no question. And a lot of this, of course, is personal data mixed in with non-personal data, which just causes a bit of confusion. A lot of it's very unstructured, particularly things like emails. You've got all sorts of stuff in emails. So, what are the issues around this? Well, processing must be lawful, fair, and transparent. You've sort of heard that already today. And you need to have a legal basis. Now, I know Laura was saying consent. Well, she was talking about marketing, and typically in marketing you are going to need consent. But typically outside marketing, you do not want consent. I think one of the things I've got most sick of since the GDPR came in is seeing articles written claiming to know all about GDPR, saying you must have consent to process personal data. It is the most pernicious myth around, because essentially there are 6 legal bases for processing personal data. Consent is one of them, which in general the regulators say should be a last resort legal basis. And if you actually do what seems to be being advocated, which is to get consent and have another legal basis, then you're actually misleading your data subjects. So it's not fair processing. Because if you're going to process it anyway because there's a contract, and you ask for consent, that consent is totally misleading. Because if they withdraw it, they'll still process it. So you need a legal basis. So if you're monitoring staff, surveillance, for example, you should use legitimate interests, which I think is the same one that Laura was talking about when she was saying you can use your right to object. Because in that context, you can, if it's using legitimate interest basis, you have the right to object. So you would use legitimate interest for monitoring staff, but be very, very careful about it, because staff, of course, do have a right to privacy, at least to a certain extent, quite a reasonable extent, in the workplace. So you should be carrying out a data protection impact assessment. I don't know if anyone here has ever done any of these. If you're public sector, you probably have. If you're private sector, you probably haven't, realistically, unless you're a bank or something of that sort. And the things you need to worry about are things like transparency, because if you are going to carry out surveillance of staff, they need to know what you're going to do, what data you're going to take, and under what circumstances you're likely to take it. And of course, they need to know your purposes. Why are you carrying out surveillance if you're going to do it? These are absolutely essential for getting anywhere near compliance. So other issues, retention. Well, this sort of goes around in circles a bit. You're only allowed to keep data as long as your purposes apply. So if you didn't have purposes in the first place, you shouldn't have got the data at all, because its purposes don't apply. So you need to worry about any of this dark data. Do you have a real purpose for having it? Are you going to use it? If you've got your CCTV, set up what the purpose is. And if your purpose runs out sort of 2 days after you collect it, which in many cases it could do, don't keep it any longer. Apart from anything else, if you get a subject access request, and you've got stuff sitting in there for 30 days, and you've got to try and track down data, that can be a headache. If it's only 2 days worth, it's a lot easier. So security can be an issue with this. If you get data breaches and you have to report them, well, you report data, you report information about a data breach of information that you should not have had. That could be an interesting problem, and the regulator looks at that. You shouldn't have had the data, and it was breached. Serious nightmare. Subject access requests, data you haven't, if you don't know you've got it, how can you deal with a subject access request? And the data subject may have some way of knowing you've got it, even if you don't. Rectification becomes a problem, again, if you don't know you've got it, or if it's sitting in a backup somewhere. Rectifying backup data, I think there's enough techie people in here to know that that's an absolute nightmare of a problem. Erasure, exactly the same problem. Trying to poke into backups, depending how they're done, but in general, for most backups, again, a nightmare. So issues there around backups, with retention, rectification, erasure. These are sort of areas where you have nightmares coming up. Okay, on to the last major slide. Dark data is typically not purposely hidden, but rather badly maintained and governed. I think that's clear from sort of the way we've been looking at the types of dark data. Cataloging it along with your purposes and your retention period, legal basis, privacy notice, etc., is almost certainly the hardest part of your personal data audit. And I sincerely hope all your organizations have done your personal data audits. If you haven't, you should really, really be worrying. Because if you don't do this, you've got no way of knowing whether you're meeting your obligations, and you can't claim to be taking data protection compliance seriously. So you've got to dig about for all this tricky data. Most of the stuff people start thinking about when they look at their data audit, they'll say, oh yes, we've got employee data, name, address, date they started work, we've got their qualifications, we've got all that sort of information. We've got customer data, name, address, phone number. We've maybe got a marketing database. That's all our data, isn't it? Well, there's an awful lot more sitting around in tricky places. Unless you identify that, you cannot get to be compliant. So essentially the issue here is you've got to make sure you know what data you've got, why you've got it, and once you know why you've got it, you can work out your legal basis. And I think it's not rocket science, but it needs doing. So, I have time for some questions, if there are any. That's because I was picking on you.
Does this work?
I wasn't really picking on you.
I don't understand this technology.
Yeah, go for it, Peter.
Does this work? This works.
Hi, Tim. I work for Royal London. I'm senior
yeah.
information security
I have
officer.
actually had some of your solicitors in some of my training sessions.
So, when we talk about the dark data, one of my biggest concern, and something that perhaps you didn't mention, is the principle of data minimization.
Yeah.
So now the ICO is...
That actually relates very closely.
Yeah. So now the ICO is quite concerned about data ethics, and many of our companies, they have behavioral analytics and CMs. Yeah. So how all the software, all these tools, how we can get to an agreement, because I think that somehow they breach the data minimization principle, because you are collecting more data. Yeah. All these engines, all this intelligence needs a lot to learn. And then it's also with data retention.
Right, so you're doing sort of machine learning stuff.
Yeah. So it's getting quite complicated. And when it's a subject access request, an employee that leaves the company, imagine that applies the right to be forgotten. Yeah. What do you do with all that logs? I think anything, as soon as you get, I think this relates back to the comments at the end of the last session where it was about the legitimacy of certain models of activity. I think big data, machine learning, AI, which all intermingle. Essentially, I don't see how, unless anyone changes the law, this can be compliant. Because fundamentally, you've got to have do you really know what your purpose is when you start looking at this data? Simple answer is you don't. And do you know how long you're going to keep anything? No, you don't. So you cannot, I think, genuinely be compliant in that sort of sector. And at some point, this has to be addressed. But I think for the moment, you've just got to do it. Pragmatic answer. But I do sympathize with the issue very much, because I know it's very difficult, that one.
Thank you. Hi, I have recently worked in local government, and I've worked within some of the schools, and one of the issues we had was about bring your own device, and the issues with the schools knowing that some of the kids, in order for finances and things, for some of the kids to bring their own devices. The issue that the schools were looking at when we were doing the GDPR analysis at the time was about the access that the children had mainly to the server in the schools so that they could get online. There wasn't really any consideration about any other kind of data that they should be maintaining or collecting as a result of the children bringing their devices in. Is there something that they should be considering then? Is, you know, I mean, obviously,
I think it comes down mainly to essentially worrying about security issues. Because unless you know what people with these devices are doing, you're not able to maintain security. So it is, I think, worth considering logging the activities online. But again, making sure the kids know this is happening, which actually will go a long way towards stopping them doing things they shouldn't, as long as they know that's happening. But I don't think, there's no real thing saying you've got to do this. But things that you need to do to make sure the system is secure and they're not bringing in malware, they're not visiting websites they shouldn't, and so on.
Well, they'll be working under the firewall of the school anyway, because the access is to the school's own server, which has quite a tight firewall. So is there any purpose for them then to collect any other kind of data about what the children are using the devices for at the time when they're in the school? Because obviously they're limited by that.
Their devices may already have some sort of malware on them. So it's worth actually monitoring that in some way, as far as you possibly can.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we've got room for a couple more questions, if there are any.
Hello, Susan.
Hello, my dear. After talking yesterday with you, Tim, what's your opinion on biometrics data?
Oh, it almost comes into the same phrase I would use for Facebook, devil's spawn. I have had discussions with people from the Scottish Government on this, actually, through the Law Society. The trouble with biometric data, of course, is if anybody gets it, they've got you for life, because you can't change it. It scares the life out of me, biometric data. Because I'm aware of some of these schools now that are using fingerprints for sort of payment for meals. And I did actually put a Freedom of Information request into the most recent one that was announced. I think it was East Dunbartonshire, wanting to know whether they'd done a DPIA. If so, can I see it? Yeah, I worry greatly about it, because nobody can keep anything safe. You can't. So, yeah.
Technology is changing every day, especially facial recognition, fingerprinting. We all know that iris scanning can be hacked. But how do you control that data and where it's going?
Ah, now you want to sell some software, don't you? Some software is now developing that can keep things pretty safe, but the question is, will they use it?
Can I ask a supplementary question? I know it's a bit of a cheek me since I'm in charge of the microphone, but security is now moving towards continuous assurance, which means it's looking at patterns of keystroke monitoring. CCTV can be used to identify people by use of gait, how they're walking, and so on. So you've got continuous monitoring. So
the gait is biometric data, of course.
And also keystroke patterns become biometric data.
So, was that a statement or a question?
Does it raise any new issues, I guess, is the question.
I don't think they're fundamentally different. It's just that there's more of it and more room for people to find bits of it lying, by hacking in. Unless you can keep it safe using Susan's wonderful software.
Okay, one more question. Do people on this side want to ask you?
I'll get my commission later.
Okay, one more question, okay.
I'm always confused with the sort of GDPR phrase of pseudonymization. And every time I look at it...
At least you can say it.
Well, every time I look at it, I think an algorithm to pseudonymize data over a period of time is inherently data itself. And if I store this data in a pseudonymized way, I would always be able to recreate it. So is there actually such a thing as pseudonymous data, or is this just something that GDPR got wrong?
It's not something new, actually. It's been used a great deal in sort of clinical trials and things for many years. It's not intended to be something that's totally secure in the way that encryption should be, but it gives a better level of security by separating things out. So it's a bit more secure than it would be if you left it all in one file, basically. Does that make any sense?
Yes, so if, for instance, I have user IDs from a supplier, and I do not want to have to deal with deletion of data, and I choose to pseudonymize them effectively how I store the data, would I really not have to worry about this? Because the moment they sent me new data, I could still identify who these people are. Is that correct?
I think it's still personal data. That's what I was thinking as you said that,
Sorry?
Yeah.
I talk about personal data and anonymised data on a sliding scale of pseudonymization.
Oh, yes, okay.
But I do think that pseudonymized data reduces the risk.
Yeah.
You will know it can be more and more safe, and then you get to the stage that it's almost so pseudonymized that it's almost anonymized and your risk is reduced. And that's all about that putting it back together again and how likely it is that that will happen, or how possible that that is that will happen. And so it's not personal data, pseudonymized data, anonymized data.
And certainly and it's certainly the intention that you can put it back together again as an organization to recreate the data. But if somebody does it not without the approval of the organization under the new DPA, that is a criminal act. Or tries to do it even. It's a nice little the heading for that. What's the word, the name of that section? It's something like, it's the re-identification of de-identified personal data. It's the most wonderful little line in the Data Protection Act. Something like section 55 or something like that. For the geeks.
Right, thanks, Tim. I'm now going to try to get my PowerPoint up onto this computer, and then we'll do my session. But thanks very much, and hopefully... But I'm hoping you'll hear more from Tim and Laura in the next session as well.